let me do the professor thing for a second. Let me give kind of a lecture a bit, and then kind of framing things. And then what I want to go on is talk about the sociology of this, and talk about what we're calling privileging forces and where they came from and why they might be relevant to you. So if you have the patience, I'm just gonna yammer for a bit. So if you look down on the Google Doc, you see the topics that I'm going to cover, and I'm just going to pop down through those. So the history and context of the humanitarian movement is pretty deep, right? If we go back pretty far in history, maybe 1,000 years, humans have always had empathy and have always tried to help out community members in need. So that is kind of woven into our cultural DNA. So the idea of humanitarianism is kind of a 20th and 21st century kind of trope. But having said that, the fact that communities reach out and support members in their community that are affected by disasters is as old as humanity. We've always been doing that. We've just begun to call it the humanitarian sector in the last 50 years because it has gotten bigger, more organized, and more significant, frankly, in terms of a force on the planet. And so if you imagine world history, we went through a long period of empires, the Mughal Empire and the Roman Empire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then just in the last couple centuries, we have transitioned into a nation state system, right? And some would argue we're on the backside of that nation state system where we are again being dominated by empires. And perhaps this time, instead of empires like Genghis Khan and the Mughals, these empires are the Jeff Bezoses and others like that. That is corporate empires. That's a long discussion off topic, but in that stage of nation state that we're in right now, the League of Nations was established in 1919 as a way of addressing, in the post-World War I era, addressing the causes of that. We don't want to do this again. A lot of people died in World War I. We don't want that to happen again. Also, very relevant to what's happening right this second, we were at the tail end of a major pandemic, right? Very similar to what we're going through now. And so the collective wisdom of humanity was that we needed some kind of way to collectively, as humanity, capital H, to address human problems, not just on an individual level, individual nation state level, but a global level. Right. And so the League of Nations was established in 1919, and then that transitioned into the United Nations in 1945. Another major stopping point on this development was, of course, when Henri Dunant traveled through the killing fields of Solferino and saw all those soldiers wounded and suffering, and wrote A Memory of Solferino, which turned into the motivation for the origin of the Red Cross. 3 years later, the International Committee of the Red Cross was established in 1863, and then the IFCF, International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, was established in 1919, making it even more global. And as you can see on the bullet points there were other major NGOs that were created after that. The part of the deep history goes back to World War II. And this is a very important point. What was characteristic of the entire planet leading up to World War II, and most would argue, and I would agree with them even now, is endemic racism and classism. And so as we fought World War II, the positive, if you want to look at it in a very weird way, the positive outcome of World War II is that essentially history grabbed us by the lapels and said, is this the best you've got? In other words, we tolerated Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, we tolerated and eventually were repulsed at our toleration of this immense racism. Interestingly, we had ignored this kind of genocide, not that much earlier in the Congo, when King Leopold was responsible for killing roughly 10 million Congolese. And so, we didn't take ourselves collectively as the Western world by the lapels then, but when a bunch of white people in Europe got killed, then it was a little bit different story. And so, again, at the end of World War II, with the inception of the United Nations, we collectively took ourselves by the lapels and said, are you going to address this? That is, collectively as humanity, are we going to reject the assumptions of racism? Are we going to reject the assumptions of the legitimacy of colonialism? And so in 1948, one of the most important documents, I think, in world history is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The senior leadership on that came from a woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, but the committee that wrote that document was from every continent except for Antarctica. And so it was meant to represent humanity, not just the West, not just the global North, but humanity. Does it do a perfect job? No, but it's a good document in that it begins with, you can see there in the notes, it begins with Article 1, which says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I would edit that to be sisterhood, but that was the wording in 1948. And so as we look at the history of the humanitarian movement, I would divide it into pre-Universal Declaration of Human Rights and post-Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Before that, I think there was a good deal of paternalism embedded into, or at least a larger degree of paternalism, because it still is, a degree of paternalism woven into the entire, what was then an emerging humanitarian sector. And so with World War II, we had to, with what happened in World War II, we had to address racism, and we had to address the basic assumption, are we one humanity? And the answer, very explicitly so, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was yes. And so we had this very big, if so, then what kind of question posed? If so, then wow, how do we unpack and interrogate the embedded impacts of colonialism, racism, classism, and patriarchy? And those are huge questions that still loom over where we are right now. And so, I think there was a beginning then of questioning, but having, and this is a big but even though we said never again after the Holocaust, what happened in Rwanda? What happened in Bosnia? What happened just recently in 2017? In 18 in Myanmar. That is, we have genocide after genocide after genocide. Humanity is still coming to terms with its lack of maturity, its lack of an ability to address the basic point that, as it says in that first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The world history as it has evolved, since the writing of that, is basically demonstrating a large gap between what we say in that document and what we do as a global community. Certainly, if you're a Palestinian, or if you're a Rohingya, or if you are an Armenian, you have felt the lash of racism and pogroms of various magnitudes unleashed upon you. And so, yeah, kind of are bad. And so this is the context surrounding the rise of the humanitarian movement. And so back to that little list of organizations. Humanity responded, by just like Henri Dunant did when he saw the killing fields of Solferino. He decided to do something about it. In the immediate term, he organized relief, but in the long term, he helped found the International Red Cross. And so he is, a person who has been mimicked over and over again by various other people. For example, if you look at the International Rescue Committee, for example, founded in 1933, that was the brainchild of Albert Einstein, none other than the Albert Einstein. And so, he founded an organization, and similarly, Oxfam, founded in 1942, it's called Oxfam because it was founded in Oxford, England, by a bunch of people that saw what was happening in World War II and said, we can do better than this, to let people suffer without getting aid. And so Oxfam rises up from a small committee of people in Oxford and goes on. And then we have World Vision in 1950, World Relief 1944. MSF comes on the stage in 1971. And BROC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, now building resources across communities, came up in 1972. And so these big major NGOs, household names, I hope you've heard of most of those, those percolated up. At the same time, you can see there in the notes, I talk about the rise and fall of various Mongos, an acronym that you might not see anywhere else, but to me, a Mongo is a my own NGO, Mongo. And so if you look at the IRC, International Rescue Committee, that was Einstein's own NGO. I want to do an International Rescue Committee, but his INGO, his Mongo, turned into an immensely successful and highly respected, and long-term NGO. At the same time, you maybe know one or two people that have started their own NGO. I want to help, street kids in Bangkok. So I'm going to get Daddy's Trust Fund and create my own NGO and create orphanages for street kids in Bangkok, right? Mongos are, and when I've done the research on this, Mongos are seen as a plague by humanitarians that work in the major entities like World Relief or IRC or MSF or whatever, because they tend to organizationally get in the way. And so, for example, when you respond to a disaster and you're trying to organize things and get things moving in an organized fashion, what you don't want is some do-gooder coming in and doing something that conflicts with or is on top of what you're doing. And so Mongos are well-intended, but frequently have negative consequences in the long term. The caveat, first, do no harm, is certainly something that we all think about as humanitarians, but many of the Mongos have had, in retrospect, a net negative impact. And we only have to go back to looking what happened in Goma in response to the Rwandan genocide to know what happened when you had a lot of NGOs kind of climbing on top of each other and trying to get space and giving out aid. So, that's one of the things that we could spend hours on, looking at the history of the rise of the humanitarian sector. One of the biggest changes was the rise of the UN, United Nations. Now, in terms of international major humanitarian responses, the UN is the go-to umbrella organization. Most work goes through and most funding goes through the UN. And so prior to the UN, This was done as a catch-as-catch-can kind of fashion. And then once the UN began to embrace more and more its role in terms of responding to humanitarian disasters, it amped up in the last several decades. It's amped up its impact. Just as a parenthesis here, as an organizational wonk and a bureaucracy wonk, I want to talk about the fissioning of various INGOs. And I've got two quick examples of that. Organizationally, everybody that has had any interaction with any bureaucracy knows that bureaucracies, the bigger they are, the more inefficient they tend to be, right? And so one of the things I find interesting as a sociologist is how, for example, I'll use MSF as my first example. It started in 1971 as just a bunch of French doctors saying, we want to provide medicine without borders, right? But as MSF grew and grew and grew, it is now fissioned into many semi-autonomous sister organizations. So there's MSF Canada, MSF USA, MSF Switzerland. Do you get the idea? And so instead of one big cumbersome bureaucracy, it fissioned into smaller, more agile aid agencies. In fact, MSF USA responded to COVID in the United States. Another example of fissioning is Oxfam, which, as I said earlier, started in Oxford, and it grew bigger and bigger. But it had that bureaucratic growing pains of getting too big, and now it's fissioned into Oxfam USA, Oxfam UK, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's 10 sister Oxfam organizations. And so that's maybe more than you wanted to know about the history of the humanitarian sector, but that's a quick thumbnail sketch. The humanitarian imperative is something that has been, I think I said this at the top of my presentation, it's been embedded into humanity for as long as there's been humanity. And in fact, the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have it deeply embedded. The concept of tithing within Christianity is you're supposed to give a tenth, hence the word tithe. You're supposed to give a tenth of your income to the church, not to build bigger cathedrals, but to help the poor. That is, to assist people that are temporarily or long-term marginalized. And so if you look at Islam, the concept of zakat is exactly the same thing. In zakat, you have a moral responsibility as a Muslim to give to the imams, give to the mosque leaders funds. You're supposed to help organizationally through the organization or individually. And so this humanitarian imperative that says, and I'm reading from the Code of Conduct of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, the very short definition of humanitarian imperative is that it's the right to receive humanitarian assistance and to offer it. And further, it is to be given regardless of race, creed, nationality of the recipients, without adverse distinction of any kind. Priorities are calculated on basis of need alone. And so the humanitarian imperative has been kind of clarified over the years, and this is I think a good articulation of it if you want to read that in a bit more detail later. That brings up talking about the humanitarian imperative, and believe it or not, I'm about to take a breath and give you a chance to ask some questions. But if you are thinking about the humanitarian imperative, it leads directly to questioning what the humanitarian principles are. How do we move forward as a humanitarian entity? What principles guide our behavior? Every organization has a mission statement, and if you want to phrase it like this is the mission statement of the humanitarian sector. It revolves around these four principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And perhaps in other classes, you've had them beaten into into your head as these central principles, that a humanitarian organization needs to move forward with humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And these come from Dunant's interactions on Solferino. He didn't care on what side the combatants were. He was going to minister to the needs of everyone. In fact, in the villages where some of these soldiers were taken, you would have combatants on both sides of the battle in beds next to each other being mended to. That is, he was functioning, focused on their humanity in an impartial way, in a neutral way, and he wasn't being directed by any government. He was doing it in a very independent way. And so those four principles have, for the history of the humanitarian sector, been kind of the guiding principles. But 2 years ago, a couple researchers down at Deakin University in Australia, Matt Clark and Brett Paris, came up with another questioning of the humanitarian principles, suggesting that things have changed, times have changed. Is it time to revisit those old humanitarian principles? And their offer to us is for us to look at equity, solidarity, compassion, and diversity. And I will link onto this document the PDF of their paper. I haven't done it so far. Maybe I have. No, I didn't link it. But I'll link the paper so that you can take a long look at it. It's a good review of the humanitarian principles, the old ones and their new ones, and the rationale for the new ones. One of the most important things that they point out is what we are facing right this second, and what you will respond to as disaster respondents. You are going to respond to environmental disasters. And you guys are in a growth industry. Unfortunately, we are seeing a superstorm forming right this second in the Northeast. We see all kinds of climatological events leading to mini disasters here, or bigger storms, flood surges, et cetera, all over the world. And so their paper, if you read it in detail, puts a heavy emphasis onto looking at our relationship with the environment and how that has caused and will continue to cause major disasters that you as professionals are going to have to respond to more and more and more. Unfortunately, that's not good news. That's bad news. So I urge you to take a look at that, and I'll link it, and you guys can keep this link. So that is a quick run through of what I wanted to say, but I added this last thing. I'm on the typology of events needing humanitarian response, and I wanted to have this as a transition point to have you ask a question, or rather offer some comments. So this is a typology, very crude, very simple, obviously, a typology of events needing humanitarian response. Typically, we do this binary. There's natural, like the earthquake that your professor mentioned a few minutes ago that just happened, right? So that's a natural one. And then what is going on right now, the humanitarian disaster in Yemen, the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, et cetera. Those are caused by human conflict. And so what I've added here is just a little prod that some of these are fast moving and episodic, and some of them are slow moving and chronic. And so, can you fill in, and maybe we can do this in real time. You guys have access to this. Fill this out in real time. Give me an example of a natural fast moving, and hint, I just mentioned one. Type that in. Somebody be the quick on the fingers. Yeah. Hello? The earthquake, right? Yeah, that would fit in. Yeah, so that would fit in there in that cell. Come on, anonymous anteater. You know you want to type it in. Go ahead. What is the name of that? What was the name of that volcano that erupted? We can just put Tonga. Yeah. Give me a slow moving. Anybody know anything about Ethiopia? Anybody know anything about Bangladesh and the rising waters? In Ethiopia, long-term chronic drought, long-term chronic food needs. This is not just 1 or 2 years. This is now a decade. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, in many places in Sub-Saharan Africa and around the world, of course, are having crop yields changed dramatically by climate change. And so this is slow moving, but ever more present. I think the example of the nor'easter happening just now up in Boston and New York, that area, I think that's an example of a combination of a fast moving, but that's a symptom of, and another example of, this chronic climate change. And so fast moving, that's low hanging fruit. You guys can fill in that part of the cell very quickly. What about conflict fast moving? I don't know, when Russia invades the Ukraine, that's going to get kind of interesting if they do. Ukraine situation. What about if North Korea finally decides to chuck one of those ICBMs to wherever? So that's a fast moving. Slow moving might be, I'll give you guys an example of this. So slow moving might be something like what's happening in Myanmar right now. I know a lot about that because I've written a bunch about the Rohingya and so on. And what's happening in Myanmar is democracy has been stillborn and has now been taken over by a long-term military junta. And the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military is just for now decades long has been marginalizing both ethnic and religious minority groups. One of those minority groups are the Rohingya. And if you know anything about that situation, there was now being adjudicated in an international court of justice. There was a genocide in Myanmar. And so that was kind of an acute phase, but this is a chronic systemic marginalization of racial, ethnic, and religious groups in Myanmar. And so that's a chronic one. And so as you look around, you can see examples of all 4 of those cells. But I'm going to add one bit of confusion to this and point out that binary, natural and conflict, I think that binary is pretty false binary. I think there are things which are a combination of both. That is, for example, climate changes lead to food shortages lead to conflict. If you look at what's going on in northern Ethiopia right now, that very horrible and ugly conflict, in part that is caused by the long-term food shortages caused by climate change. And so there's a false binary between natural disasters and conflict-oriented disasters. And so as humanitarians, we always need to keep in mind that although binaries can be nice and tidy, reality is not that way. The fact that, and it was Colin Powell that finally said the quiet stuff out loud. He called the humanitarian aid organizations like MSF, like World Relief, he called them force multipliers. Wow, if you're a humanitarian and you base your work on being independent, what you don't want to hear from the US Secretary of State at that time, Colin Powell, is for you to be called a force multiplier. Basically, that is, saying, yeah, you guys are doing our work for us. You're winning the hearts and minds of these Afghani people by doing all the things, and you're beating the West is great drum for us. You guys are force multipliers, right? And so, yeah, that reality that humanitarian aid is always political. Despite whatever rhetoric people might have, humanitarian aid is always political, in small measure or in large measure. Again, I can just imagine those aid workers on the ground just wincing when they saw those two words, force multiplier. The face palms must have been just epic at that point. I mean, did you really say that? And so, yeah, good question, Dylan. And that's one of the chronic problems within aid. But let me get to a second part of your question, which I think is fascinating, and I've written a tiny bit about this. Arcaro's view of the world is that we are either going to recognize humanity with a capital H, or we are going to continue to fetishize national sovereignty, right? The United States, America first. Russia, Putin is so hyper nationalistic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've read enough science fiction, and I've read enough apocalyptic future books to know that a world where people base their decisions on nationalistic decisions just isn't going to work. We've got to function with humanity, capital H. The responsibility to protect doctrine that Dallier helped push for after Rwanda, the responsibility of the international community to respond to a sovereign state which is unable or unwilling to take care of the welfare of people within their boundaries, right? That was the origin of the responsibility to protect doctrine, passed in 2006 by the United Nations. And it essentially begins to question the fetishism of sovereignty, of sovereign nations being able to do whatever the hell they want. The global community has responded to that in the past. For example, in my lifetime, where the world community looked at South Africa and said, not so much, dudes. If you guys are going to have apartheid, we're going to economically strangle you. And I remember back in the day being part of protests to divest Elon University from any holdings in South Africa, so that we wouldn't be contributing to the apartheid in South Africa. And so we've had that questioning of national sovereignty. But as I look at Myanmar right now, basically what we're saying is, yes, we know there's a genocide, but we don't want to go in there because we're going to tick off China. And we can't do that because, well, China, right? And so humanity is at this juncture where we have, and I'm going to use that phrase for the third time now, we have this fetishizing of nationalism to the detriment of the long-term development of humanity with a capital H. And you all are young enough to see how that is going to play out. It will, I think, especially as we address environmental issues, focusing our responses as nations as opposed to humanity is an absolutely impoverished perspective. I can't say that any more demonstratively. If we don't see the need for creating a transnational entity which can steward our planet's health, because national interests and global interests tend to conflict, right? We can't get any change in terms of our energy policy because we're tied up with the corporate interests. And so it's the national interest. We need jobs for Americans, or Putin wants to get more domination of oil for Russia. And so we've got to get over this. And if we're going to address the environmental issues overall, we're going to have to get rid of this fetishizing of and absolutely kowtowingly ugly respect for national sovereignty and go to another level. That's just my opinion. As a sociologist that has looked at this, looked at the big picture my entire career, it is a future focused on nationalism. Just I don't think is tenable. I just don't. And maybe there's other views, and I'm sure other strong views could be articulated, but that you've heard what I had to say. So I'm looking at the clock and going panic. Let me stop again for question or comment. I want to get into my little red wagon, this confronting toxic othering idea, and explore that a bit with you. So question or comment as we move forward? All right, I'm going to move on then. I think somebody put in the comments, maybe it was Douglas, nationalism was a leading cause to World War I. Yeah, we don't learn. Yeah, I think the best quote along those lines is I can't remember who said it, but the lesson we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. I've lived through that as obviously an older person. I've lived through that over and over again. We seem to be unable to learn from lessons of the past. And it's just, it's pretty, hope is hard to come by sometimes, I'll put it that way. Parentheses, how many of you have seen the movie Don't Look Up? Yeah, a few people. Documentary or not documentary? Yeah, and that's an example of us not social commentary. Well, a documentary, I'm kind of making a sarcastic point saying that, this is, 50 years from now, it'll be basically a documentary. I'm looking into projections, and the paper that I'm going to hyperlink for you guys, the Deacon and I'm forgetting the name of the second author, the Deacon article on the different humanitarian principles. That's what they focus on. They can provide a lot of interesting data projecting climatological changes. More than you want to hear, but I had my intro to sociology students. This is interesting. I had them project into the future 50 years, right? They're 18, 19, 20 somethings. They're going to have 50 good years, hopefully. What will the world be generally habitable by humans in 50 years? 35% of the 100 students that I surveyed said no. These are just typical students, right? Intro to Soc students. They're from all over. And they are looking at a world when they get my age that will be profoundly different because of climatological changes. And so, as humanitarians, I think, and this is what the Deacon article stresses, as humanitarians, we have to look at that and go, we've got to be sober, folks. And if we're not going to be sober, and this is, if we're not going to be sober, we're going to end up paying for it. And this is one of my biggest issues with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that what it didn't put in there, this is not my original thought, this is Mark Du Bois's thought, but what it didn't put in there was assuring a planet for future generations, right? It talked about the dignity of humans, right? Yeah, I get that. But it didn't emphasize what indigenous people around the world, especially in North America, have pointed out, is that we don't inherit the earth, we borrow it from our children. And the borrowing that we're doing right now, we're not necessarily going to have anything for them to get when they are my age. And so again, my intro to SO students, of the 100 students, 35% of them said, yeah, I don't think the world's going to be generally habitable. Is that Debbie Downer kind of doomsday stuff? Or are they reading the same stuff that came out of Glasgow, a couple months ago, when the world got together and looked at the environmental impact? If you read some of the stuff coming out of Glasgow, it was pretty sobering. And so I'm back to my point. You guys are in a growth industry. There will be more disasters of all kinds of things. And it's our responsibility to understand the larger context in which these things are happening as professionals and leaders in the field. So, close scene on that. Question, comment? Right. I can't answer that without putting all my cards on the table. But if you read anything I've written, you will see that I put my cards on the table. I'm sorry, your name is?
Oh, sorry. Yes, my name is Malia Volmert.
Okay.
This is my first crisis and disaster management class, so I am not well-rounded in everything yet, but I'm getting there.
Well, welcome to the field. It is tough. It's tough. The short answer, and putting my cards on the table, is the phrase "follow the money." What is the major force driving human history? At this moment, and certainly probably for the last 50 years, and maybe for the last 150 years, it has been neoliberalism, which is an economic system that is based on the assumption that businesses will be able to and be motivated to understand, identify, and address all human needs and monetize the satisfaction of those human needs. Ever since Reagan and Thatcher, and certainly way before that, neoliberalism, the ideology behind capitalism, is basically let the market work it out, right? Let the market work it out. And that has been the major force kind of driving history forward. Follow the money. If you want to understand the world, just look at where the money flows and how the logic that it flows. And so the big kind of the answer to your question lies in addressing the normalization and glorification of gluttony and greed.
Yeah,
I'm pointing my finger to you. Yeah. The Margaret Mead quote that people have on their dorm rooms, be the change you want to see in the world, or no, that's Gandhi. The Margaret Mead one is that never question that a small group of people can't change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. The idea is that, I used the phrase normalization and glorification of gluttony and greed. And that's what has happened. We allow Elon Musk to make more money in a day than I would make in 10 or 20 lifetimes in one day, right? And so we prop these people up as kind of exemplars of, wow, isn't that wonderful? We have normalized and glorified what can't be described otherwise as gluttony and greed. I need more, right? The best comment I ever heard along these lines was one guy talking to another. They were about to go to this very rich person's house for dinner, and the comment was, "Well, I've got something that he'll never have." And, how is it? This person, has everything in the world and could buy anything in the world. And he says, I have enough. And what we have is an ideology that has glorified and normalized. There's never enough. You need to have more, right? And so, that means on an individual level, as we look at glorifying and normalizing that kind of gluttony and greed, it means not allowing that comment to hang in the air accepted. Wow, isn't Elon Musk, I'd love to be like him and have all that money. No, we don't want that. And if you look at, you've read all the stuff I've read, if you look at the pooling of wealth in the last, just since COVID, right? Just since COVID, the number of billionaires that has been created has gone up astronomically, right? And so the pooling of wealth, not just nationally, but globally, is getting more and more extreme. And so, one of the answers that is very unsatisfying is that we have to change that system. We have to denormalize and de-glorify gluttony and greed, in part because those things lead to the rationalization and justification of things like racism. And so, if you want to look at the origin of racism, I think we've always been ethnocentric toward each other, but the most horrible form of ethnocentrism was, let's go back to Leopold that I mentioned a while ago, King Leopold, killing 10 million Congolese, right? How do you justify that? Well, those people are less than, they're subhuman, right? You have to have some way of framing it in your mind to justify and rationalize that. And so the greed of King Leopold, I'm going to have him be my poster boy of evil. King Leopold couldn't have enough palaces, couldn't have enough gold, couldn't have enough, ivory and rubber and wealth. In fact, he owned personally the Congo. At one point, the United States was a signature to a document which gave him rights to own it, right? Basically normalizing gluttony and greed. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think something to add to that is a lot of deserving as well. The ideology of everyone thinks that they deserve more than what they
Right.
get. So I definitely agree with the greed there. Because that's mentioned a lot, like, well, I deserve this, I did this, I deserve that. Like, well, you don't really need any of that, but people are deserving now. So
yeah, I absolutely think that everybody needs to get what they need, but I think some people should get more than others. My wife is a veterinarian, right? And I have no trouble whatsoever that she makes roughly 10 times more than the person cleaning the kennels. I got no problem with that. But, there's an upper limit there, right? Mm-hmm. What we've got is a system that has normalized somebody getting, or by orders of magnitude, so much more. How much does Jeff Bezos make in a day, or Elon Musk make in a day? The orders of magnitude difference between them and my wife, for example, making 10 times more. I've got no problem with that. People shouldn't be paid the same, but I think the orders of magnitude that we have allowed to be normalized is absurd in the long run and not sustainable in terms of the health of the planet. I'll use that as my ending point. Let me transition and talk for a second about this. If you can take a look at that nice color picture, privileging forces. Let me unpack that before we end today. And again, you're welcome to buy the book, or you're welcome to get the PDF. But this is something I put together in the last year or so. The graphic was designed by a good friend on the faculty of mine here at Elon, Ahmed Fadam. He's an Iraqi refugee, but he now teaches at Elon. And the backstory behind this was that I was invited to the ALNAP conference in Berlin in 2019 to comment on various privileging forces and be part of a panel talking about how these privileging forces are part of what the humanitarian sector needs to address. And so the first five from left to right, you can see patriarchy, race and ethnicity, colonialism, paternalism, heteronormativity, hetero and cisnormativity, and classism and class privilege. Those were the privileging forces. And immediately when I saw that, I went back to my intro to Soc and remembered that as I was talking about, for example, racism, I would give this definition of racism when we covered that chapter. Racism is an ideology of domination and subordination based upon an assumption of the inherent biological or cultural inferiority of some group and the use of that assumption to legitimate and rationalize the inferior or unequal treatment of that group. Blah, 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 long-winded definition, but the next chapter is on gender, right? And so I told my students, give me a definition of sexism. Sexism is an ideology of domination and subordination based upon an assumption of the inherent biological and or cultural inferiority of women and the use of that assumption to legitimize and rationalize the inferior and unequal treatment of women. Give me a definition of classism. Classism is an ideology of domination and support. Do you see what I'm getting at? All of these isms have the same mechanism underlying them. They're the same body, right? And so all of these privileging forces are caused by othering. And if you scroll down, you can see the othering defined. Othering is there's normal othering. A doesn't equal B. Therefore, A doesn't equal B. Some people have vaginas, some people have penises. Some skin has higher myelin content than others, right? We are different. The human family has a lot of diversity. A doesn't equal B, right? That's differentiation. That's normal othering. Yeah, people are different, right? But that tends to horribly, it tends to degenerate into toxic othering, where whenever there's an asymmetry of power between one group and another, that power is used to systemically marginalize the other. And so you have toxic othering. A doesn't equal B, therefore A is better than B. And that mechanism of toxic othering underlies the patriarchy, underlies racism, underlies colonialism, underlies all of the other heads of the hydra that you see underneath there. And so the book, Confronting Toxic Othering, is, if you understand what the critical race theory is, critical hydra theory is essentially interrogating the intersectionality of and the deeply embedded nature of all of these privileging sources in all cultures. That was a big sentence and a big assumption. But critical hydra theory is essentially critical race theory on steroids. It is basically saying not just racism is deeply embedded into policies, laws, and norms, but the patriarchy, but classism, all of them are just woven into, in a huge tapestry, woven into all of our cultures. And so the cultural context that we function within is one where there are all kinds of embedded privileging forces. And so one of the things that you and I can do is take a look at our positionality, right? Maybe a word that you haven't heard of, but I am older, white, male, cis, global north, able. Do you get where I'm going at? And so you can do your own status inventory, right? And every time you interact with anyone else, you have a different positionality vis-a-vis that person. Does that make sense? So what is your positionality, and how is that positionality vis-a-vis the other people you're interacting with? And how does that frame the interaction or interactions you are going to have? When people see me, my master status, what they see, not what I want them to see, but what they see is they see a white male, right? And I know what that means. My positionality has privileged me in all kinds of ways, right? And I know that the positionality that I see in another person similarly frames their life chances. in very profound ways. And so as a disaster worker, one of the responsibilities you have is to understand your positionality, understand where you lie with regard to all of those privileging sources and privileging forces, and how you see yourself both understanding and dealing with those privileging forces, and your role in either supporting or questioning those privileging forces. Wow, that's a lot of deep social change theory, but yeah, I think you guys are following along. And so the book, Confronting Toxic Othering, is a series of blog posts that I did that kind of talk about the development of the idea and give examples of the idea. You know, it hopefully will be a teaching tool that you can take a look at and go, now I see some of the connections. In the last chapter, I write to humanitarians. You know, it said, you know, okay, what does this all mean on a Tuesday morning when you go to work? You know, what does it mean that you now understand this? And so in the last chapter of the book, I write a little note to what you can do. One of the things that you can do is understand othering and the difference between normal othering and toxic othering.
Tom, I apologize, but I have to intervene. I will stop the recording right